In this video, we'll perform a series of sequential requests on a Mongo database from a Node application. So a request from a Node application to a Mongo database is an asynchronous request. We do not really know how long it will take for the request to be received, processed, and then responded back to us. So Mongo provides two mechanisms for communicating the result of the request back to the server. So the first is using callback functions, and the second is using promises. So promises is something new that's been added in ES6, so as of ECMAScript 2015. Later, we'll look at some syntax sugar for using promises in ES8, which is called Async-Await. So a callback function, how do they work? So it's what might look a bit complex to start with, but its simplest form, our function definition here. So we have some function which is going to take in a value and define a callback. Our value will be alerted out to screen, and when our function is completed, it will then call the callback function, which will then go and do something. So a callback function is a function passed to another function as a parameter and is then executed after another function has finished executing. I know there's lots of other functions in there. So this is our original function, our callback function. So this is a function. So we're doing this as a named function here at the moment. So this is a named function called I am done. So when we actually go to use this function, we will pass in a value, which is our subject, and another function, which is the callback. So when this function completes, it calls this function. So what we should get from this, and when we do this, we should see an alert saying starting coding assignment. And then soon after, we will see another alert, which is saying finished assignment for coding. So we have the original function and its callback value. So more normally, you won't see it as named functions like we have seen just back here, where we have our callback function as a named function that we reuse. We'll probably see them done as anonymous functions. So in this case here, we would do assignment, coding is the variable or the subject we're passing in, and the function, rather than referencing a named function, we will be calling this anonymous function. If another option we have is also to use an arrow function. So the second usage down there shows the same thing, just using the arrow function syntax. All three options, either the named function, anonymous function, or arrow function, will do the same thing. So let's go now and have a look at the Mongo example using a callback function. In this example, we've got a simple Node application. So I've installed the MongoDB driver using the npm-g install MongoDB, and I've not used any other routing or any other modules. So it's just simply a Node application that connects to a Mongo database. So in this example, we will, one, connect to our Mongo database, which will be called testdb. We will request and update some data in the database. We will then query an item, or query that item in the products collection to find out how many units it has. We'll then update that item by decrementing one of the number of units available. And then we will get a listing of all the products and display them. So to get these requests to happen one after the other, and this is important because we don't want to be getting our final result before we've actually decremented the count for that product, we'll have to use we will be using in total 5 nested callbacks. We're lucky that Node Mongo driver supports both callbacks and promises. If we don't use any callback functions, then Node will by default return a promise. So if we have a look at what's working here, we're requiring our Mongo client. I'm defining a URL for where my Mongo server is located, which is on port 27017 on my local computer. This is the first of the callback functions. So the Mongo connect method has a callback function. And so in this case, I'm not going to do any more of my code in here until we have a connection and the callback function for that is called. So here they're using an anonymous function. So all of this code here is the function that is the second parameter of the Mongo connect method. So if an error was returned in our function, then we want to write something out to the console. I'll then just define the name of my database and then make a reference to that database in a variable called DB. I'm then requiring in this object, and this object has a method in it called update data, which will then have a callback for itself. So let's go in and have a look at this query callback.js. Okay, so we have this external file, which will be used from the module.exports. So here is our method for this object, and this is the function. It's going to take in a reference, as remember, for our DB, so that when we call this update, we're passing in a reference to our database, so we know which one to connect to. And it's going to return a result as its callback function. And so we can see this is the callback function, is an anonymous function. So on the callback, we're going to take whatever the result is and we're going to console log it. So back to our function. So in here, we're creating a variable here, which is a reference to the products collection in our currently used database. I'm doing a simple find one request, and this is where Mongo once again provides a callback function availability for us. So then what we have here is everything that is going to get done on the return of the find one. In this case, I'm hard coding it that I'm finding a value that has an ID of 1. So given the return of this, so this will be returning back to us the information coming from our database. So I can pull the units value from what returned from the find one, and I can minus 1 off that. And this is then creating a new query that I will pass to my update one function. So I'm going to update the same item with some new values, which is this new query. This will once again return another callback function so that everything within here is then run if this comes back. So this will then update our values. And then the last thing I want to do is to get a reference to all of the items that are currently in that particular collection. And I'm going to convert those to an array so that they're easier to log out. And then here is the last of the callback functions. And so the result of this callback function is to call the callback for this particular function, which will then bring us back. So just skip back once more. So the last value of res, so this is the result of our find that's been turned into an array, will be passed back as the result here that's coming into our function, and we're going to console log that value. So let's have a look at that actually running. So this only happens, because it's a very simple example, when we start up our node server. So let's do our node server.js, and we'll see here what's happened. You can see this is the end result of all that happening, which is a listing of all the items that are currently in our product database. So we can see here that product ID 1 that has a name of widget 1 now has 7 units. If I cancel that and run it again, we'll see that our item number 1 now has 6 units in it. And once more, we'll see that our item now has 5 units in it. So this, using callbacks, has been able to do a series of functions that are all asynchronous, so that only one happens at a time and the values from one can get passed down to another. Now you can see that this can get a little bit messy if we have a large number of items that need to be done serialized one after the other, that we can end up with something which is termed as callback hell, that we have, a whole heap of values are then dependent on the callback of a previous one. So that will lead us on then to having a look at the use of promises and how promises can help clean up our code and make it a little easier to read. A promise is short. A promise represents the eventual results of an asynchronous operation. And promises are chainable. There are 3 states that a promise can be in. It can either be pending, meaning it's still happening, the result hasn't happened. It can be resolved, that a result has been found, or it can be rejected, that we have some sort of an error. So while a promise is pending, it could move to either resolved or rejected. Once resolved or rejected, it cannot move to any other state. Promises can be chained together using its then method. So following the try-catch pattern in synchronous code, errors can be managed with a catch method. If any method of the chain fails, the nearest catch down the chain will take control. The catch does not end control of the function, it just reports an error. Another then can come after a catch, as can more catches. So let's look at the general pattern of using a promise. So here we see a function called SumPromise function that demonstrates the chaining together of a number of promises. Each will be resolved before moving to the next then. So we have our first function here that is going to return a promise. So when it has returned, some result will come back. And in this case, we're then going to call another function called the next async function, which also returns a response. And it's going to take a value coming from the first async function. When this next async function resolves, so when then that happens, we're going to take a value that returns from that async function. And in this case, we're just going to then console log out some information with potentially some information coming from the response of this async function. If we had an error in here, then if we had an error in the first one, it would drop through till it found the first catch down the chain and would then use it to put out an error message. We could have more thens happening after this catch, and if there was another error in those thens, you would want another catch below, as it will drop down to find a catch to do that. So compared to the nested callback functions, you can see that this can be a lot easier to read. So if we look at a sort of a cleaned up version of this function now using the arrow functions. So we can see here that this is a lot easier to read and to sort of decipher what's happening. So we'll have some promise function that's returning a promise. So when this comes back, then we will do this. When this comes back, then we will do this, else we might have an error. So compare that to using without the arrow functions. You can see once we use that, this does come out looking really nice and easy to read. You can create your own promises by calling the new promise function, and it has object, and it has two callback functions. So it will either resolve or reject. So resolve is called when the promise is resolved, and reject is called when there is an error. And until one of these is run, we then are in a pending state. So coming back to our example where we were using the callback functions. So let's convert this now to, rather than using a callback function, we will do this using promises. So we'll just comment out what we've got here at the moment. And I've added in another module here, which will be given that Mongo, if you don't pass it a callback function, it will give us a promise. So it gives us best of both worlds here. So for our promise version of this functionality, we're going to find, the same as last time, find one item that is of the ID 1. When that comes back, so when we get a response, we will then use a value from that response. So we'll grab the units value and decrement it. And what we will do is then do another query, which will do an update. Our queries return another promise. So when then that has happened, we will then do another query, which is then going to return a response, which will be an array of the values of everything that's in that particular collection. So exactly the same that we did in our callback function using callbacks. So here we used our callbacks for each of our queries. For our promise, here we'll be using the .then. So when a value comes back from this particular promise, then we will do this. So let's go and have a look at that actually running. So let's come back to here. So we'll just run our server again. And we can see here that we have 9 units in our number 1. Let's just run that again. And we'll now see that we have 8 units in our number 1. So we're now working with our promises. Well, in fact, I was still working with callbacks there because I hadn't actually saved my server file. So let's save that and add in the code that we need to do our promises. So this is going to be calling an object in, let's just call it our query from promises, and we're going to be requiring our promise.js file. And pretty much I've kept it. At the moment, our promise or our function here is doing a callback, so it will be calling back, but the work that it's being done inside here is being done with promises. So now that we've saved that, we should be able to come back and run this again. Hopefully I didn't create any errors. And so here we've now decremented down to 7. So what I did is I added in a require of a query promise, which was this file. We were calling the update data method on that, and we were having a callback function, so that at the end of this thing, so remembering with a callback function, it at the end of the response, you will call that function passing a value. So once everything is done in here, then this function gets called. So all we're doing here is when we're at the end of our chain of thens and we have the value that we want, I'm calling the result callback function and passing in the value for response. We've got one more option to look at, and this is the Async-Await. So Async-Await is syntactical sugar that's been only added in ES8. So that allows us to write our asynchronous code so that it reads like synchronous code. So we do this by adding the async keyword before our function. And this turns it into an asynchronous function, meaning that it will return a promise. So the await keyword does as it says, and it waits for a promise to resolve. You might notice that in this option we don't have any error handling. So given that we're writing synchronous like code, we can actually go back and use the standard try catch options to manage error handling. So for this, we have our async function defines this as returning a promise. We will then have this other function here will return a, it's an asynchronous function that will return some value into some var1. We could use this variable and pass it into the next one, but this will wait till this resolves to get some variable. And when we're done, we can return some variable back as we need it. So that's just sort of a general pattern of what we're looking for. So let's go back and have a look at how we can refactor our code from we've used callbacks, we've then used promises. Let's add that syntactical sugar and change it to an async await. Okay, back at our code where we left off with using promises. So let's change this now and we'll get rid of our promises and let's add in a version of this using async await. So I have another function here with the async await stuff set up in it. Wait. And so our async await, remember, it's going to return a promise. So query AW and our update data, and we'll pass in DB as our reference to our Mongo database. But in this case, we're then going to use the then keyword because this is a promise, so we need to wait for it to resolve before we can actually get information out of it. And let's say what we get out was called result, and I'm using our arrow functions here to do this. And in here, what we want to do is to just console.log our result. So what we're doing here is we're requiring in our functionality, which I'll show you in just a minute. When we call this function update data, exactly the same as we did it with callbacks and with promises. I should say that. Except this time with our async await, it's going to return a promise. So in this case, we will have to use the .then to get the result that comes back. Well, when the result comes back, we will then use that result and do something with it. So let's look at the actual function. So here I have set this up to be an async function. And here we get our change in code. So here we've got that this value response is equal to an await of the find one Mongo method. So this will wait until it resolves and put this value into response. We can then use the value of response to set up this next query. We will then await another promise coming from Mongo. In this case, I'm not needing any values that are returning back from this, but I do need to wait for it to happen. So once it's happened, I will then do my third call here, where I will be doing a find of all the values in the array and sending that back to response. And then my return from my async function will be the response, which is a promise, which will then bring us back to our server, where we can then, when it has resolved, we can print out the results. Let's save that and just go and check that we're working. So if we run this again, and I have an error. Okay, it seems like I had a small typo here where I called it Async-Await, but when you look at the file name over here, it wasn't that. So let's just go and change that, save that, and come back and let's try again. Let's just clear the screen with CLS and run our node server again. And here we come back, we have our result being written back out to the console as we've asked for here. So now we've seen three different ways of doing essentially the same thing. One with using callbacks, one with promises, and one using Async-Await. Another method which you may have seen in using your Angular applications is using observables. So observables use the RxJS library, the React library. So it's not built in as part of JavaScript as the callbacks, promises, and Async-Await are. So it's an external third library. And observables are different to these promises in that you're actually creating a link to a stream of data rather than something where these promises are short in that you get a value once and then that's it. There's no ongoing connection that we have with observables. So observables are another option on top of using callbacks, promises, and Async-Await for doing asynchronous data. Okay, thank you.